Welcome everyone. With the soon to release Callisto Protocol, which has one of the co-creators of Dead Space, and the remake of Dead Space coming out very soon, I really wanted to kind of dive more into them, and I found this great Dead Space Iceberg. It covers the entire Dead Space series. So I figured let's just go ahead and jump into this one. And I gotta say, even some of these later on, I knew nothing about. Throughout all in Dead Space. I played all three games, or the three main games, and before we jump into this iceberg, I just want to say I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. So Isaac is mute. This is the idea that in the first game, because Isaac never talks except to scream whenever he's using a melee attack, and he's just a mute person. This is kind of explained by the idea that Isaac has psychological trauma, given the fact that it's later on revealed that he suppressed the ending to Nicole's video that she sends him, and the fact that he's in a ship filled with monsters roaming through the vents that are hunting him. I'd be a little quiet too, trying to sneak around. Engineer for CEC. This is the fact that Isaac was an engineer for the CEC, or the Concordant Extraction Corporation. While he was working for them, he was part of their Merchant Marines division, which is used to explain how he's able to use guns. Even though he may have been an engineer for the Merchant Marines, he probably still has some kind of basic training, kind of like people in the military still have basic training, even if they're not going to be out in the field. Cut off their limbs. This is the fact that to essentially stop the Necromorph, you have to cut off its limb. And you also get told this through audio logs, and it's written on the wall in blood when you first find the plasma cutter in the first game. This is because Necromorph is essentially an infection that's taken over the host's body. So trying to destroy organs such as the heart really won't do anything for you anymore. They don't do much, so you need to cut off its limbs, which essentially doesn't actually kill the Necromorph, I found out. It essentially just makes him immobile and useless. And the reason you don't have to cut off all the limbs, by the way, is because it's a game. It'd be really annoying if you had to fight 100 enemies and you had to cut off every single one of their limbs just to be able to progress past them. Survival horror. This is the fact that it's kind of debated online whether or not even the first two Dead Spaces are more survival horror. I guess as you get on the harder difficulties, they become more survival horror because there's less resources around. But some people argue that they're more action horror. Definitely the third one is more of an action horror. They moved well away from the horror aspect, so I guess more action survival. EarthGov, this is the organization that actually kind of runs things right now. They're the head honchos. They're also the ones who took Isaac after Dead Space 1 and tried to extract the marker blueprint and everything from his brain and got him to help them make more markers. They came about due to a revolution that happened before, long before Dead Space 1, back in like 2200, where they overthrew the previous administration, which was called the Sovereign Colonies Administration. The EarthGov group then just created an Earth-centric government. Weapons in the first game are tools. This is actually true. Pretty much all of the weapons you use in the first game, short of the plasma rifle, I believe, are all just actually engineering tools. The plasma cutter was just an engineering tool. The line rack and the rest of them are all just engineering tools repurposed to kill, since all you really need to do is cut off the limbs of the creatures versus destroy their organs or their brain or something like that. I mean, it was an engineering ship, not a military vessel, so they didn't have like a lot of military equipment on there. Is kind of why you use engineering weapons. The marker reanimates the dead. This is just the fact that the marker can reanimate recently dead tissue, and kind of how the whole Necromorph thing starts to begin with. Unitology, this is the big religion that you're kind of fighting against throughout the game. They formed around the black marker, which is the first marker that was found on Earth. The red markers are basically just copies of that. They essentially believe in convergence and rebirth. They believe that convergence will help lead to the next evolution or stage of humans, because they kind of believe in like a hive mind mentality. Will all come together and be one. Plasma cutter, this is the iconic weapon of the game. You typically see him in all the concept art using this. It's also the very first weapon you get to use in the game, and there's typically, at least I think in the first and the second game, an achievement and trophy tied to just using that weapon for the entire game and not using any other weapons, which it's a really good gun. So, death animations. I'm not 100% certain what this one is talking about specifically. There's just a bunch of animations where Isaac is unalived. All the Necromorphs typically have their own unique ones whenever they unalive Isaac. So, I guess that's what it's going for. There's just many unique animations for Isaac dying. The year is 2508. This is just the basic fact that Dead Space 1 takes place in 2508. Age is 7. I know that on the iceberg it's backwards, but it's supposed to be VII. This is just the planet that the Ishimura is planet cracking in an effort to mine resources. It's also where the red marker is found. In the USG Ishimura, this is the planet cracking ship. This is also the first planet cracking ship, I believe, is the ship that you fight on throughout the entire game. It's over a mile long, or it is a mile long. Nicole Hallucinations, this is the fact that Isaac sees a lot of hallucinations of Nicole, whether they're full body, sometimes just audio, and sometimes he just sees her face on video screens throughout the entire first game, and even in the second game as well. And actually in the Valor, one of the video screens that shows Nicole's face for a split second right as it cuts out will show her face as just a skull. Fun fact for you, just to make things a little bit creepier. Black and red markers. So I mentioned earlier that there is the black marker, which is the original marker that was found by humans. It was found in the same crater where the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs was. So it's largely believed it came on that asteroid, or it may have wiped out the dinosaurs itself. We'll get more into that one later, I promise. But this is just the fact that there is the black marker, which is the original, and then the red markers are recreations that other people have made. They just don't have the same mineral to create the black veins that you find in the black marker, and so they use, I believe it was bismuth, to make the red veins. Marker-induced dementia. So dementia, first off, it's spelled wrong on the iceberg again, but that's okay. Dementia is actually the wrong word for this. I don't even really know why they use dementia in the game. Psychosis would fit a hell of a lot better, but this is just the fact that people who are around the marker for extended periods of time will start having hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and violent behavior. Nicole is dead. This is the fact that if you take the first letter from every chapter in the first game and you put them all together, you will get the phrase Nicole is dead. Which, by the way, they didn't do this in the second game. We'll get more into this one later as well, but the second game is, as far as I'm aware, the only game that does not have one of those chapter secrets. Grab tentacles. So throughout both the first game and I believe the second game, there's tentacles that will come out of the wall and actually grab Isaac. These tentacles are actually entities on their own, and sometimes they're also part of larger entities. Sometimes they're part of the Leviathan and the Hive Mind, for instance. So these are just tentacles that come out of the walls and grab you. And interestingly enough, they are sometimes their own entities. That I did not know. Immersive HUD. This is just the HUD in the game. It's very well loved by lots of people. It shows Isaac's health, his oxygen, and his stasis all on the back, which works really well with the over-the-shoulder camera angle. You also can see how much ammo you have in your weapon whenever you aim it. It works very well. This is also kind of explained, the fact that all of this information on his back is that it's for other people to see, since engineers are typically part of a squad or a group, especially if they're going to be doing repairs on the outside of a spaceship. So this way other people can see, okay, what's going on with this individual. Marker generated dead space field. So it's revealed in the book Dead Space Martyr, I believe, and in the second game, Dead Space 2, that the red markers, the man-made markers, rather, all have a dead space field around them, which essentially pacifies the necromorphs. But this just seems like a byproduct of the markers themselves as a way to kind of protect themselves from the necromorphs. It's not really certain why exactly they produce a dead space field in their immediate area. Cardboard star jump scare. So this is exactly what it sounds like. There is a cartoonish yellow cardboard star that falls down from the ceiling, essentially, in the daycare area of the second game, that actually jump scares Isaac. It's the first time that he's actually seen being jump scared, where he kind of jumps back and he screams in fright. So even though this man fights a bunch of necromorphs, he got scared by a star. Isaac pushed Nicole to go on board the Ishimura. This is actually just 100% true, as it's stated. There's not a lot to go on here. Nicole was feeling very uncertain about taking the job on the Ishimura. It was kind of like a promotion, a step up in her field, and Isaac pushed her into doing it because he thought, hey, it'd be great for your career. Norman hate. I regret to say this is the one thing I could not find anything about. There is no one, as far as I can tell, related to any of the games whose name is Norman. There's a Nolan. There's not even a Norman Bates, not even a Norman Reedus. I don't know what Norman hate is, so I apologize that I couldn't figure this one out. Okay, so I decided to double check the whole Norman hate thing just to make sure that I couldn't find anything, and I found one random Reddit comment about it. Apparently, Norman hates a play on Robert Norton from the game, and from the third game specifically, who's hated by the community, which is weird because this is the first time I find anyone referring to him as Norman. As far as I'm aware, everyone else just refers to him as Norton. But he's a character that people kind of have a running gag about. They don't like him because he's a bit of a douche. That would explain it. I don't know if it's a typo in the iceberg or if it's just a person playing on the Norton/Norman hate. But there you go. It's about Robert Norton from the third game and how people don't like him because he's a douche of a character. And it seems the other characters in the game don't really like him. God dang it. At least I got that one answered. So I can actually answer all these now. Titan Station, this is the location for the second game. It is where the fragments that were left over of the red marker from the first game, which is called Marker 3A, by the way. Fragments of it were taken to Titan Station, and they also took Isaac there and started probing and digging in his old brain to get the blueprint on how to make the marker, which they eventually did. Convergence. This is the final stage of the marker's plan, essentially. Create enough necromorph biomass so you can start convergence, which accumulates all that biomass into one giant organism called the Brethern Moon. Tau Volantis. This is the location of the third game. It is the alien world. Old group called the Sovereign Colonies found it when they were looking for the source of the infinite energy coming from the markers, only to find the horrors of the Brethern Moon and what exactly the aliens went through on Tau Volantis. It's basically a protocol that has them remove all information about that operation to go to Tau Volantis and what they found there and related to the markers in general. So they destroyed all the audio logs, all the data, all the research, all the researchers, the people who went to the planet. They scuttled hundreds of ships, which is why you have the ship graveyard around the planet. They got rid of any and all information they had about it. And it's also why you find the red marker, marker 3A on Aegis 7. They abandoned that marker there, knowing it was a dead planet and hoping no one would find it. Which, it didn't work out that way, unfortunately. Now we move on to the third tier of this iceberg, System Shock 3. This is basically the idea that Dead Space 1 was going to be System Shock 3. The studio disavowed that. They said that that's not true. Though Dead Space does draw heavily on inspiration from System Shock, both of them being kind of isolationist horror style games. EA Meddling. This is the fact that once EA started getting involved in the Dead Space series more, Dead Space kind of stopped being Dead Space. It changed drastically exactly from a survival horror type game into more of an action type game. Dead Space 2, you get competitive multiplayer. In Dead Space 3, which is where it really goes downhill, you have significantly less of the horror aspect. It becomes much more of an action game. You have microtransactions. You have a co-op campaign. All of this Visceral said was an effort to try to make the game sell more and become more of a household name, which it didn't really work out because in its opening weekend, Dead Space 3 sold like 600,000 copies, not even hitting that legendary 5 million mark that lots of game companies shoot for. So this was kind of the idea that essentially EA brought about the end of Dead Space by pushing a lot of non-Dead Space type aspects to the game. Brethern Moons, this is the ultimate goal of the entire Necromorph plan of the markers in general. As I said, with Convergence, they eventually tried to get enough Necromorph biomass to create the Brethern Moon. The Brethern Moons were also hinted in Dead Space 2 in the Unitology Church. You can find references to them. The Brethern Moons don't seem to have emotions. They do have a bit of sadistic nature, though, so that's always great. And they consider themselves one entity and a god. Ellie's miscolored eye, this is the fact that in the second game, Ellie loses her eye to Nolan Strauss, but she gets a new one by the third game. That's because before the third game, when Isaac and Ellie are still together, they buy her a prosthetic eye, essentially. And it's just miscolored because they couldn't find a color they couldn't find the same color eye that she naturally had. So it's just a miscolored eye. Just a miscolored fake eye. The Machine. So I'm not exactly certain what this one's referring to. It's two possible things. It's the big machine from Tau Volantis, which was used to freeze the whole planet, or It's the eye poke machine from Dead Space 2. I'm going with the eye poke machine because that one's a little bit more interesting, because I found some actual interesting information about that, and there's not too much on the freeze the planet machine. There's just a lot of speculation. So the eye poke machine is actually called the Noontech Diagnostic Machine. It sticks a needle through Isaac's eye to access the lateral geniculate part of the brain. I don't know that I pronounced any of that right, but I apologize. It's the part of the brain that the marker stored all its information in, such as the blueprints on how to make more markers. And that's the part that they're trying to get into, so this way they can make more markers in Dead Space 2. Isaac built red markers. There's not really anything specific I can find about this, about Isaac physically building the markers from the second game, because he was kept in stasis throughout most of his time before the second game as they were torturing and interrogating him. But there is one line which he says in chapter 13. In chapter 13, upon seeing the giant marker, he says, "Oh my God, I built that." That's pretty much all I have to work off of that one. He didn't physically build the markers. They just took the blueprints from his brain and then used that to build the markers. So in a sense, he kind of did it because he was a blueprint guy, but he never physically worked on it at the same time. The marker is sentient. So this is the idea that the markers have some level of sentience to them, whether it's artificial intelligence or it's actual organic intelligence. It's kind of unknown, but the markers have some agency when it comes to how they go about achieving convergence, such as when they put hallucinations in people's minds. In Isaac's brain, they use Nicole specifically. So they have some ability to kind of sway people. And they can also kind of create more complex necromorphs to aid in whatever current situation they're in. So they seem to have some level of agency to them. Isaac's mom was a Unitologist. This is just a basic fact. Is as it says, Isaac's mom was a Unitologist, and is actually the reason Isaac hates Unitology. His mom essentially stole his college fund to buy the next level in the Unitology church, and because he sees them as being the ones who indoctrinated his mom, and so she stole his money, he blames them for all of that, and he doesn't like Unitology. But his mom was a Unitologist. That's all that one is. Gunnar Wright. I'm not exactly sure why this one's so far down here. Gunnar Wright is the voice actor for Isaac. He voice acted him in the second, third game. He's also uncredited as the voice actor in the first game on IMDb. I don't really know how that one works, but that's what they list him as. Even though Isaac didn't talk much, so I assume he just did like the grunting and groaning noises and the meleeing noises. He's also going to be the voice actor for Isaac in the Dead Space 1 remake, because apparently Isaac will talk more in that game, which will be interesting to see. They Dead Space 2 marker fragments on main menu. This is the fact that throughout the neural pathways in the main menu of Dead Space 2, there are fragments of a marker. And as you play the game and progress through it, eventually these pieces start forming together until you reach the very end where they form a full marker. Game chapter spell and acronym. So I mentioned this one earlier. All of the game chapters, except for 2, as far as I'm aware, all spell out an acronym or a word. In the Dead Space mobile game, it is "He Will Betray," which is a reference to Tyler's loyalty to Carrie. In Dead Space 3 Awakened, which is the big DLC post game, it is RIP, or Rest in Peace, RIP. For Extraction, it's Warren Lies. The first game, Nicole is dead. In the third game, Brother Moons are awake. The art director says nothing for the second game was done. You can find chapter names for the game. They don't appear in game, but they do appear in the official game guide. But the reason for it is because they did it for the first game, didn't do it for the second one. They saw that people really missed it for the second game, so they redid it in the third game, according to what the art director said on Reddit. So there you go. Baby in the washing machine. In Dead Space 2, you can find a washing machine at one part that has a kid's teddy bear in front of it, and the washing machine is running. It's believed that the mom may have put the child in there in an effort to protect it from the necromorphs, and maybe a necromorph turned it on trying to get to the child. Another possible theory is there is I believe it's an audio log, maybe a text log, but there's an audio log, we'll say, that talks about a mother who had to unalive her own child because it got turned into a necromorph. So it's possible that the child in the washing machine is that child. So Dead Space 2 goes a little hard on some of its fucked up nature. Shooting range minigame. This is just the fact that in the first game, whenever you go into the Valor, there's a shooting range minigame. You can get ammo, health packs, a ruby semiconductor, and power nodes for beating all 5 levels. And you also get an achievement when you beat all 5 levels. So the minigame. That's all there is to it. I guess part of the question is, why the hell does a military ship have a minigame like that with a reward system versus just a target range? But there you go. That's all that one is. Now we'll move on to the next level. None of the main cast die by a necromorph. So I think this is mostly talking about the second game. In the first game, this is clearly not true. Hammond gets killed by a brute. Kendra gets killed by the hive mind at the end of the game. So, but in the second game, I wrote all these down. Nolan Strauss is killed by Isaac. Hans Tideman, again, is killed by Isaac. Gabe Weller sacrifices himself and kills a bunch of necromorphs by opening an airlock, ultimately saving his wife and child. Diana Ligoon is killed by EarthGov gunship. Foster unalives himself. In Dead Space 3, Austin Buckle dies from hypothermia since there aren't enough snowsuits. Jennifer dies from falling. Robert Norton is killed by Isaac in self-defense, and Arthur Dayek is killed by debris after restoring convergence. Ellie leaves Isaac. This is just the fact that Ellie and Isaac break up before the third game. They got together after the second game, but then broke up. The reason being, Isaac didn't want to confront his past trauma that he had been dealing with from everything he had to deal with to sum that one up, and he wanted to just essentially run away from it versus Ellie wanted him to confront it and take it on and overcome it. Isaac's age. Isaac was born June 5th of 2465, which makes him 49 years old. Though, if you count for his time in stasis just before the second game, since they're keeping him in stasis to kind of keep him comatose until they need to interrogate him and dig more in his brain for marker secrets and blueprints, he's probably closer to 47 years old. Classic aiming. This is just a setting that you have in, I think, some of the later Dead Space games versus center or classic. Classic is just whenever you hold out the plasma cutter and you can see the lasers, and the lasers interact with the environment, such as hitting a box, showing that this bolt will only go so far. That's all that one really is, and they kind of fade off in the distance. Center aiming doesn't do that, and it has the reticle in the center. Michael Altman. Michael Altman is the martyr prophet for the Church of Unitology. Unwanted prophet, essentially. He didn't want to be it. He had that role thrust upon him. He found the black marker back on Earth, back in 2200. He brings it back to a science station so it can be studied, and people start coming under the influence of the black marker and start worshiping as a deity. But Michael doesn't, because he's resistant to the marker. He has that same immunity that Isaac has, for instance. Altman eventually tries to reveal the secret of the black marker to the public as a whole, but he gets captured by a government agency that wants to try to use the black marker because, again, the marker people believe is an infinite energy source. But eventually the government agency that captures him takes some of the genetic material from the marker and injects it into people, which is what creates the first necromorphs. Altman then tries to go and destroy the black marker, which he eventually succeeds, but is later on killed by some more government people who go on to found the Church of Unitology. The Church of Unitology largely believes that he was assassinated for speaking out and was killed by the government, when in reality he was killed so they could take his brain and get all the blueprint material from it, kind of like what they do to Isaac, except they don't have their own eye poke machine yet. That technology, unfortunately for him, hadn't been invented. The first marker. This is the black marker. It is the marker that arrived on Earth 65 million years ago, potentially on board the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. And it is the one that all of the other markers are based on. Make us whole or make it whole is a mantra repeated by the Church of Unitology and people affected by the marker. It is a signal that is essentially sent out through the markers to help people complete convergence for them. It is also the signal that gets sent out by the incomplete Brother Moon on Tal Volantis, trying to get people to come back and turn off the old machine. Planet cracking. Planet cracking was the idea that is what the Ishimura and other planet cracking ships were created for, and that you essentially rip out giant chunks of a planet and you mine the resources out of it like that, which creates huge instability to the planets and the entire solar system they're in. But the first planet cracking ever was done on Titan, one of Saturn's moons. CEC's logo. So CEC's logo is a basically big clamp, a giant C clamping on a red sphere in some instances. And many people online thought this essentially meant that CEC controlled the Martian government at the time, or the Martian colony. This is kind of disproven by the fact that the CEC logo also comes in gold, so it's the clamp on a golden planet. So not really good speculation for that. It's also the icon used for the Dead Space PC game. So there you go. Tau Volantis aliens froze their planet. This is true. The Tau Volantis aliens, as I mentioned earlier, used a big machine that they created to freeze their entire planet by essentially removing their atmosphere and letting in just the vast coldness of space. That's essentially how I got explained online anyways. But they basically flash freeze their planet and it pauses convergence. It works. A marker killed the dinosaur. This is something I kind of mentioned earlier. The idea that the black marker is the thing that wiped out the dinosaurs and not the asteroid. The black marker arrived 65 million years ago, potentially on the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, or instead of it being an asteroid, it was just the marker that hit the planet. And then it did its all marker stuff and wiped out the dinosaurs. Because the idea is that the marker needs a capable and sentient and intelligent enough race to be able to develop more markers for it. Isaac killed a marker in his own mind. This is just the fact that in Dead Space 2, after using the eye poke machine, Isaac fights Nicole in his brain. And he also can, after defeating her, he can then start accessing parts of his brain that were being controlled by the marker. And by destroying it in his mind, he's able to essentially remove the parts of his brain that have been taken over and have been inflicted by the dementia of the markers. Isaac hates Unitology because of his mom. I kind of mentioned this earlier. Isaac's mom stole his college fund, basically, because Isaac wanted to go to a really nice engineering college, but couldn't do it because his mom took all of the money so she could buy the next tier membership in the Church of Unitology. And so Isaac hates Unitology because he sees them as the organization that corrupted his mom into doing that. Altman didn't start Unitology. This is, again, something I mentioned earlier. Altman didn't actually start the Church of Unitology. He was given the title of prophet unwillingly by the church because he was the one who revealed the black market to the world, and they believed that he was killed by the government for doing that, so they martyred him and turned him into their messiah, their prophet for the church. Foam Finger. This is just a really powerful weapon that you can get in Dead Space 2 and 3 for beating the game on the hardest difficulty. Isaac uses one hand to aim his plasma cutter. This is just the fact that in Dead Space 1 at least, Isaac will use one hand to aim his plasma cutter if he's standing still. If he's moving, he'll use two hands, but if he's standing still, he'll just use one hand to... Isaac didn't age between Dead Space and Dead Space 2. Again, I mentioned this earlier, because they keep him in stasis the entire time until they need to take him out and start digging in his brain and to interrogate him to get more information about the marker. He essentially doesn't age during that time because he's frozen in stasis. The hacker suit. The hacker suit is a special suit you can get in Dead Space 2 if you have a save game file of Dead Space Ignition on your hard drive. This would also remove one level of challenge from the hacking minigame. Dead Space 2's callback to the ending of Dead Space 1. In the ending of Dead Space 2, Isaac and Ellie are again leaving on like a gunship, which happens at the end of Dead Space 1. Isaac then turns over and inspecting to see another Necromorph or Nicole hallucination once again. All he sees is Ellie. So it's almost an exact replica of the ending of Dead Space 1, except this time his dementia is essentially removed. Isaac worked on the Ishimura at one point. It's mentioned in the Dead Space Extraction comics that Isaac worked on the Ishimura at one point in time, probably doing some repairs or upgrades to it. The Ishimura was like 20 years old by the time he was born, so he didn't help build it, but he got to work on it. Who killed Michael Altman? Their names are Craig Mark and Stevens. They kill him both to help found the Church of Unitology, and so this way they can take his brain and get all the marker blueprint information out of it. since the iPoke machine hadn't been invented yet. Isaac Clarke's name pays homage to two sci-fi writers. This is the fact that Isaac's name is based on two sci-fi writers, Isaac Asimov, who is considered one of the big three sci-fi authors, and Arthur C. Clarke, who is another one of the big three sci-fi authors. Robert A. Heinlein is the third one, in case you were wondering. Isaac knew Nicole was dead from the beginning. So this is something that Kendra mentions at the ending of Dead Space 1, is that Isaac has essentially repressed the ending of Nicole's video, that he knew all along she was dead, because at the end of the video she unalives herself. So this is just, again, the fact that his whole psychological trauma had already kind of started setting in before the game even began. Isaac weighs 255 pounds with his suit on. In the beginning of Dead Space 2, you can actually step on a scale while still wearing the straitjacket, and Isaac's weight shows as 195 pounds. If you go put on a suit, his weight becomes 255 pounds. Apparently this also fluctuates with whatever suit you're wearing, what some people were saying online, but his weight will go up to 255 pounds with the suit on. Brethern Moons were teased in Dead Space 2. I mentioned this a bit earlier. The Brethern Moons were actually teased in Dead Space 2 in the Church of Unitology. So there are statues worshipping spherical objects in the church, and there's also images of a bunch of spherical objects, again, that are linked together. They match Serrano's presentation in Dead Space 3. These are actually just the Brethern Moons, and the linking is basically showing how they're all telepathically linked to their hive mind. Rock worshippers, this is just a derogatory statement that people use towards the Church of Unitology members for when they don't like them. Unitologist theme of unification stands in contrast to the game's theme of dismemberment. This one is just self-explanatory by the name of itself. It makes sense. The Unitologists ultimately want convergence, which is where we all come together into a big Brethern Moon, and they're being led by the markers and the Brethern Moons ultimately, versus Isaac's trying to stop all that. So he's dismembering it, taking it apart. Resource wars, this is just a bunch of wars. This is a bit also what caused the overthrow of the Sovereign Colonies Administration before and the installation of the EarthGov, is because people were ultimately fighting over the dwindling resources of Earth and its colonies and going to war with each other for it. This is also part of the reason people turn to the markers, because, again, the markers pose themselves as infinite resource machines. But these eventually start subsiding with the invention of planet cracking and are ultimately done by 2508. The marker created humans to create markers. This is something I kind of touched on earlier with the marker killing the dinosaurs. This is the idea that with the death of the dinosaurs, part of the reason was the marker needs capable, intelligent, sentient creatures that it can A, use to create more markers, and B, turn into necromorphs. So this way it can create the convergence and create a Brethern Moon. So it creates humans, so this way it can essentially go through its reproduction cycle by having that capable race that creates more markers. So it so more markers can keep the convergence cycle going. Tiedemann is actually the good guy. So Tiedemann's technically the main antagonist for the second game, but you can find a text log called Tiedemann's Last Hope. There he talks about how he was getting research grants to keep Titan Station going because they were running out of money. They were going to lose the station essentially. So he was getting funding to continue doing research into means of procuring more resources, more energy specifically. And so he turns to studying the markers, which again are posing as infinite energy machines. Many of the people working with him say that he is losing his mind. They know of the markers' mind control capabilities. He even knows about them, but he's ultimately taking that risk because he thinks it's the only way to essentially save the sprawl and save all the families and people living on it, because they're on the verge of losing their homes essentially. So he's taking this plunge thinking he can ward it off while also saving everybody. So his character has a little bit more depth than you may have realized. His story is kind of the path to hell is paved with good intentions idea. Next we have the universe is full of dead space because of the Brethern Moons. Fermi paradox, which boils down to where is everyone? Given that the universe is almost 14 billion years old, you would think there'd be some hyper advanced alien civilization that we would have met. So either everyone is gone from the universe, or there's some reason we haven't met them. And this is the reason why we haven't met them, is that the Brethern Moon are essentially wiping out all other races. And that's why there's a bunch of dead space, a bunch of nothingness out there in space. Scientology comparisons. So many people try to compare Unitology to Scientology. And that's not the point at all that they were trying to go for when creating it. They've openly said this was not the point. The creators of Dead Space have said they were not trying to compare this to Scientology at all. This was basically just a general cult comparison. And you can make of that as it relates to Scientology as you wish, but I enjoy living, so I'm not going to say anything more on it. Isaac only calls 3 people by their names, by their first names specifically. I assume this is true. I cannot figure out who the third person is. It's not Norton. It's not Buckley. It's no one from the first game, except for Nicole. The only 2 people I can find that he calls by their first name is Nicole and Ellie. I don't know who the third person would be. Carver, isn't it? I thought that was at first, but no. So I'm not certain who the third one is, but apparently he only ever calls 3 people by their first name. Isaac equals Ellen Ripley. This is the fact that Ellen Ripley and Isaac Clarke are very similar in their character developments and just their general characters. Both of them are not military experts who go on to survive the outbreaks of their individual universes, and then both go on to become sources of information regarding the creatures they're dealing with. Mom-focused Dead Space 2 commercials. So back in 2011, I believe is when it was, there was a Dead Space 2 campaign focused around moms, essentially, in an effort to get kids' attention. What they did is they got 200 volunteers as part of a focus study where they used older females, and they showed them footage of the game and took their reactions and comments on it on video. The campaign was called Your Mom Hates Dead Space 2. You can still find commercials for it on YouTube. Some of these people were so appalled they said, quote, "Why would they make something like this?" End quote. Eventually a family advocacy group out of San Francisco called Common Sense Media tried getting it taken down and tried getting the ESRB to sanction EA and Dead Space, but nothing ever came of that. Isaac only takes damage 7 times. Canonically, in Dead Space 2, Isaac only takes damage 7 times throughout the game. The first is in Chapter 1 when the slasher pins him down, being tossed out of the train car in Chapter 2, being slammed multiple times by the Tormentor in Chapter 5, being assaulted by a drag tentacle or grab tentacle in Chapter 11, being thrown off the drill at the beginning of Chapter 13, being stabbed in the eye with the needle from the Noontech diagnostics machine or the eye poke machine in Chapter 13, and being impaled twice from a javelin gun by Tideman in Chapter 15. Dragon Age 2, Isaac is in Skate 3 and PlayStation All-Stars. These are all essentially the same thing. Isaac makes some kind of appearance or cameo in all these games. In Dragon Age 2, you can get a special armor called the Armor of Sir Isaac, where it essentially references him and makes a mention of Ellie in the description of the armor. Isaac is in Skate 3. Isaac appears in Skate 3 in the free skate mode if you enter a code. And in PlayStation All-Stars, he is also a character. Interestingly enough, in PlayStation All-Stars, his rival in the game is Zeus, the king of gods from God of War, which there's a hell of a rival to have. Engineer with psychosis, wields an engineering tool as a weapon. King of the gods can wield fucking lightning. You're gonna do great, kid. Isaac 2.0. This is an achievement / trophy you can get in Dead Space Extraction, the on-rail shooter, for beating the game on the hardest difficulty. This is also some marketing campaign that got used for Dead Space 2, which says, in Dead Space 2, engineer Isaac Clarke is more prepared for battle, having just survived a horrific experience aboard the USG Ishimura, having his improved melee and stomp attacks, enhanced kinesis and stasis abilities, and equipped with new mining tools. Players will unleash hell on the Necromorphs like never before. This time around, Isaac is calling the shots. So this was, I'm guessing, talking about the marketing material, but Isaac's posture. So it's talked about a fair bit online about Isaac not having the best of posture, at least in the first game. He's always kind of hunched over in his real gamer mode. This is kind of explained away by the fact that Isaac is hunched over in a kind of sneaking manner or in a fight or flight manner. You might see people who are going through haunted houses also have this kind of hunched over fight or flight look to them as they're going through. Isaac's posture doesn't seem inherently bad because before the very beginning of Dead Space 1 in the lobby when the Necromorphs first appear, Isaac is standing up straight. So it's only afterwards that he starts kind of hunched down in that fight or flight mode. Isaac is an infidel. This is just the fact that Isaac very much works against the interest of the Church of Unitology. Isaac works to destroy markers and holy objects of theirs and basically stop any of the Unitologist plans throughout. So they consider him an infidel. No credits in Dead Space 3. This one basically is saying that there's none of the credits or the currency system in Dead Space 3, and the reason for that, the reason it was replaced with using resources and upgrading stuff, is so this way they could push microtransactions. So take of that what you will. It is EA, so. The Thing takes place in the Dead Space universe. This is just not true at all. They took inspiration from the movie The Thing when creating some of the Necromorph characters, and they took it also from other places such as Solaris, Event Horizon as well. So The Thing was used as inspiration for the Necromorphs. But interestingly enough, when I was looking up this one, as also using The Thing, they used car crash victims as inspiration for the Necromorphs, which that has to be a really interesting thing to get told by your boss that, hey, here's a bunch of pictures of dead bodies from car crashes. We're going to need you to use those as inspiration for a few more Necromorph modicals today. Thanks, buddy. Vandal. Their real name is Carrie Norton. They're the protagonist of Dead Space Mobile. She was a Unitologist that went rogue. She essentially sets off all of the events of Dead Space 2 by releasing Necromorphs onto the station. Unknowingly, to be fair. She didn't know she was doing this. She was essentially being used by the Church of Unitology. Once she finds out she's being used, she turns rogue. She also prevents the core of Titan Station from essentially exploding and saves the whole station. Markers pose as infinite energy machines. So this one's going to be kind of expanded on as part of another one, which we'll get to in a little bit. But the markers typically pose as infinite energy machines, as I've said a few times before. This way people are drawn to them and they create more markers in the hopes of having more of these infinite energy machines around and solving their resource problem. Gooey organic sludge. So after a marker is destroyed, all the Necromorphs that it's controlling are turned into a gooey organic sludge. This happens after Dead Space 1 and you destroy marker 3A. All the Necromorphs aboard the Ishimura get turned into that gooey organic sludge. Interestingly enough, they can reanimate from that sludge if brought within range of another marker, which part of what happened in Dead Space 2. More decapitation deaths than any other death. I'm not really certain specifically what this one's getting at. As best I can tell, many of the Necromorphs that kill Isaac do it through some form of decapitation, or the fact that many of the survivors you see die from decapitation. So it's one of those two, but it seems like lots of people dying from decapitation. So this is the one that I mentioned a little bit earlier that'll expand more on the infinite energy. Markers were created to stop a species from becoming too advanced. This is essentially this idea that markers and the Brethern Moon act like the Reapers from Mass Effect, that they harvest civilizations and races before they get too advanced and wipe themselves out. As resources start dwindling, the markers start appearing, which is what you saw happen in 2200 when the black marker first started to make itself known to people, is that there's already resource wars going on and people talking about needing more and more energy and resources to supply that energy. So the marker reveals itself as essentially a infinite energy machine in an effort to get people to make more of it and to expand its influence and control over that civilization. Once its expansion is enough, it starts convergence and creates a Brethern Moon. All this is done to essentially turn the race of necromorphs of those people into one organism. They all come together and are made one, essentially, made this hive mind. So it's very much the same idea as Mass Effect. They try to stop civilizations from wiping themselves out, from being depleted of resources or going constantly to war with themselves for resources. Isaac's rig was green in concept art. This is another one I'm not terribly certain of. It's just very vague and I couldn't find much about it. In some of the concept art for Dead Space 1 and 2, Isaac's rig does appear green. But in the game, it's supposed to be blue. In the third game, it is emerald green. This may be something to do with the Mandela effect. People just remembering it being green, but in the game, it's not. But there is actually some concept art out there of his rig being green. Which came first, marker or the moon? This is the same problem as which came first, the chicken or the egg. It's unknown which came first, and this is a very interesting one. So markers are used to create moons by creating enough necromorphs for convergence to create a moon. But if to create a moon, you need a marker who created the marker, because it's believed that the moons create the markers. So they can send them out to other planets that can then create more moons. So if a moon needs to create a marker, but a moon can only be created with a marker, how does all this get started? Which leads many people to speculate, thanks to an interview that was done about Dead Space 4. I think this was not long after they had been canceled officially. They didn't reveal much about it because they were still hoping that EA might pick it up again someday. But many people think it was an interdimensional being, either one who's looking to essentially wage war and wipe out all life in our universe and dimension, or one that just is bored and decides to fuck with us. But in that interview I mentioned, they said that the necromorph problem would have been resolved, though, quote, it may be better to stick to the devil we know. So though the necromorph problem is going to be resolved, we would not necessarily be in the clear. There would be something even greater and more dangerous, very likely the creators of the marker and moon system that we currently deal with. Which that's a hell of a thought to deal with, just that quote. That the markers and the moons would be a hell of a lot better to deal with than whatever the hell else is out there. The oracles. There is not a lot known about the oracles, so I'm kind of going to give it all away because, again, it's not much. They're a very interesting group. So there's two things related to the oracles themselves and the oracle program. The oracle program is a little bit quicker, so we'll go over that first. But this is basically the oracles, the individuals, wanting to capture Lexine Weller and Gabe Weller, who both seem to have immunity to the marker. They wanted to capture them and basically get them to make baby so they could experiment on that baby and see if it also had marker immunity, whether or not marker immunity was a genetic thing or not. But they ultimately fail at doing this due to the entire outbreak that's happening on the Titan station at the time. So the entire thing gets scrapped because they essentially get killed. The oracles themselves are just some kind of high-ranking, ultra-classified agents that no one's really certain who they work for. It's kind of up in the air whether or not they even work for EarthGov or the Church of Unitology or some branch, it's a combination of the two, or someone that's even above them. Because again, there's just very little known about this group. They first appear in Dead Space Salvage comic. And they dress in all white. And when interrogating Julia Copeland, who's a lady who stole a fragment of the marker 3A, that red marker from Dead Space 1, they interrogate her, get the information they need, and then she asks for a reward for helping them. To which one of them takes hold of her hand, and a ring that he's wearing starts lighting up blue. Then Julia Copeland falls down dead with her nose bleeding, and they walk away. At some point, they also come aboard the Ishimura after Dead Space 1, but seemingly before Dead Space 2, and note, quote, reanimation is already started, end quote. Meaning they have some kind of familiarity with the Necromorph outbreak already. They knew about it. They search the entire Ishimura for signs of the marker, and they use unusual laser weapons that aren't seen by other groups, not even military groups. They eventually find a person named Stefan Schneider, who had more pieces of the red marker, and they say that they needed to, quote, know what you know and what you saw, unquote. Snyder replied that they could have asked, to which they replied that he did not, quote, possess the language to tell us, end quote. They also referred to the Necromorph outbreak that was going on as, quote, a unfortunate side effect. And then again, they appear in Dead Space 2 Severed, where they're trying to capture Gabe and Lexine Weller. They eventually use their rings again this time, this being a different group of oracles, to subdue another person named Bartlett, who was working for Taman. Bartlett was trying to eliminate Lexine, whereas the oracles were trying to capture her. So it seems like whoever they're working for, the oracles, have orders that go against whatever Tideman's orders were. So again, this goes back to the whole, they have some super high up and classified group that they're working for. And like I said, they eventually do capture Lexine, but everything kind of falls apart as they are all killed. The oracles are killed by necromorphs, and they get infected and turned into Twitchers. So some people, like I said, think that they are part of the Church of Unitology, just because they refer to necromorphs as servants in Dead Space 2 Severed. But they may also be part of the government or some kind of coupling of the two. In Dead Space Salvage, the comic, they are referred to as, quote, are designed for exactly the eventuality that's now occurring in the Dead Space universe, unquote, which kind of implies that EarthGov dispatched them to research and assess the necromorph threat. The Dead Space Salvage comic also states that oracles are rare and highly prized, implying that there are special criteria that one needs to meet to even be considered as an oracle. They're also given extensive free range to ensure the secrecy of their missions. They also have a license to kill anyone they deem a threat to security, their mission, or EarthGov integrity. And that's basically all the information we have on the oracles. They're kind of like a Men in Black unit, but we don't know who they work for or what their ultimate goal is. They seem to know about the necromorphs and just consider it a part of being the markers. We don't even know if they technically even work for EarthGov or are really humans. There's another theory that they're whatever alien creatures invented the necromorphs markers cycle, and they're disguised and assessing humans since they seem to have this immunity to the markers and are trying to investigate it. So there's just not a lot known about the oracles in general, but they're kind of interesting. But that is the entire iceberg. It's very, very interesting. I'm excited to see what happens with the Dead Space remake. I hope it's good. I'm also excited about the Callisto Protocol. Hoping it's good too. It'd be nice to get back to a nice survival horror like that. That is the end. I hope you learned something new from all this. I know I did. And as always, I really appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.